The stars had always called to humanity, and for 3 decades they had answered that call with an ambition that frightened the old powers of the galaxy. The year was 2347, when the Galactic Council decided that humanity had grown too powerful and too bold for a species so young. The council was made up of 12 ancient species who had ruled the stars for over 10,000 years, and they did not like what they saw when they looked at the small blue planet called Earth. Admiral Grace Holland was standing on the bridge of the carrier Resolute when the first warning came through. She was a woman of 52 years with grey streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too many battles along the border territories. She had known this day would come eventually because she had watched the council grow more hostile with each passing year, but knowing something would happen and seeing it happen were two very different things. The sensor officer turned to her with a face that had gone completely white. He told her that council ships were emerging from hyperspace, and when she asked how many, he could not speak for a moment. Then he said the number, and Grace Holland felt her heart stop beating in her chest. 8,000 warships were appearing in the space above Earth, more firepower than humanity had ever seen gathered in one place. She gave the order to launch all fighters and raise shields, but she already knew it would not be enough. The council had brought ships from all 12 member species, a combined fleet that could crack a planet in half if they chose to do so. The human fleet numbered only 400 ships, and most of those were older models that could not match council technology. The battle began at 1400 hours Earth Standard Time. Human pilots flew their fighters directly into the enemy formations with a courage that would be remembered for generations. The cruiser Defiance rammed a council battleship when its weapons ran dry, destroying both vessels in a flash of light that could be seen from the surface of Earth. Captain Samuel Wright stayed at the helm until the very end, refusing to abandon his crew. Grace Holland commanded from the bridge of the Resolute, coordinating the desperate fight as best she could. She watched her ships die one by one, each loss cutting into her heart like a knife. The destroyer Valiant went down with all hands after taking out 3 enemy vessels. The frigate Hope was torn apart by plasma fire while evacuating wounded from a crippled transport. Every human ship sold itself dearly, but there were simply too many enemies and too few defenders. After 6 hours of fighting, the human fleet had been reduced to less than 100 ships. They had destroyed nearly 200 council vessels, a ratio that stunned the enemy commanders, but it was not enough. It could never have been enough. The council kept pouring more ships into the battle, replacing their losses with fresh reinforcements while humanity had nothing left to give. Grace Holland made a decision in those final hours that would shape the future of her species. She ordered all remaining ships to form a defensive line between the council fleet and the evacuation transports that were fleeing Earth. Protocol Omega had been activated the moment the enemy appeared, and millions of people were being loaded onto ships bound for hidden colonies scattered across the galaxy. She recorded a message and transmitted it to every human colony, every ship, every outpost that could receive it. Her voice was steady as she spoke the words that would become legendary. She told them to run and to hide and to remember. She told them that Earth might fall today, but humanity would not die. She told them to survive and to grow strong and to come back one day when they were ready. The Resolute was destroyed at 2500 hours after taking fire from 17 enemy ships simultaneously. Grace Holland died on her bridge, still giving orders, still fighting until the very last moment. Her final act was to ram her dying carrier into a council command ship, taking one more enemy with her into the darkness. 3 days later, the council ground forces landed on Earth. They expected to find a broken population ready to bow down before their new masters. High Ran of the Dominion was the first to walk upon human soil, his tall grey form striding through the empty streets of what had once been called New York City. He had 4 eyes that scanned the abandoned buildings with a mixture of confusion and contempt. There was no one there. The cities were empty. The people were gone. In the final hours before the invasion fleet arrived, humanity had evacuated there completely, leaving behind only empty buildings and silent streets. It was the largest evacuation in the history of any species, and the council had not believed it was possible. Rand stood in the center of Times Square and declared victory. He announced to the assembled representatives of the 12 council species that humanity was finished. He called them vermin who had fled into the darkness, and he promised that they would wither and die in the cold spaces between stars. The council divided Earth among themselves like hunters dividing the meat of their prey. For the next 50 years, the council hunted humanity across the galaxy. They found 17 hidden colonies and destroyed them all, killing nearly 2 billion people in their quest to wipe out the species that had dared to challenge their rule. They established monitoring stations and patrol routes, searching every corner of known space for signs of human life. But the galaxy is vast beyond imagination, and there are places where even ancient powers cannot see. In the unmapped regions of the Sagittarius Arm, far from any trade route or inhabited world, the survivors of humanity found refuge on a planet they called Haven. They built their cities underground and hid their ships in asteroid fields, always watching, always waiting. The council believed they had won. They celebrated their victory and returned to their comfortable lives, secure in the knowledge that the human threat had been eliminated. They stopped hunting after 20 years, convinced that any remaining humans had died out in the darkness. They were wrong. Humanity was not dead. Humanity was waiting, and humanity had a very long memory. The planet Haven orbited a dim red star in a region of space that appeared on no council chart. It was a cold world with thin air and rust soil, nothing like the blue and green paradise that humanity had lost, but it was safe, and for the survivors of Earth, safety was more precious than beauty. They had arrived in the chaos of the evacuation, nearly 3 million people crammed into ships that were never meant to carry so many. Daniel Burke was born on Haven 30 years after the fall of Earth. His mother had been a young engineer on one of the evacuation ships, barely 20 years old when she watched her disappear behind her. She never forgot what they had lost, and she made sure her son never forgot either. She would tell him stories about blue skies and vast oceans, about cities that touched the clouds and forests that stretched for thousands of miles. To young Daniel, these stories seemed like fairy tales. He had never seen a blue sky or felt rain on his face. He had grown up under the pale red glow of Haven's sun, breathing recycled air in underground cities carved from rock. But the stories planted something in his heart, a seed of longing that grew stronger with each passing year. He was a quiet child who preferred reading to playing with other children. He studied everything he could find about the fall of Earth, watching old recordings of the battle until he knew every ship by name. He learned about Admiral Grace Holland and her final stand, and he promised himself that he would make the council pay for what they had done. By the time Daniel was 25 years old, he had risen through the ranks of Haven's small force to become their youngest commander. He was not a loud or flashy leader, but the people who served under him trusted him completely. He had a way of staying calm when everything was falling apart, and he always seemed to know what to do when others were lost. The population of Haven had grown to nearly 50 million people over the decades. Refugees from destroyed colonies had found their way to the hidden world, bringing news of council atrocities and strengthening the survivors' determination to resist. They built factories deep underground where the heat could not be detected, and shipyards hidden in asteroid belts where the radiation masked their work. Dr. Lisa Grant was the one who changed everything. She was a physicist in her early 40s, a brilliant woman who had spent her entire career trying to understand the fundamental nature of light travel. The council species had used the same basic hyperspace technology for over 10,000 years, and they had long ago stopped trying to improve it. They saw no need because what they had worked well enough. Lisa saw things differently. She spent 15 years studying hyperspace theory, running experiments in secret laboratories and pushing the boundaries of what was thought to be possible. She failed more times than she could count, but she never gave up. She knew that humanity needed an edge if they were ever going to challenge the council, and she was determined to find one. The breakthrough came on a cold morning when Lisa was reviewing data from her latest experiment. She saw something in the numbers that made her hands shake, and she ran the calculations again to make sure she was not imagining it. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and started to laugh because she knew that everything was about to change. She called it fold drive technology because it worked by folding space rather than traveling through it. The council's hyperspace drives created a corridor between 2 points and pushed ships through that corridor at incredible speed. Lisa's fold drives did something completely different. They took 2 points in space and brought them together, eliminating the distance entirely. A ship with a fold drive could travel anywhere in the galaxy in minutes rather than days. Lisa presented her discovery to the Haven Council, the elected body that governed the human population. Admiral Jack was there, an old man now who had been a young officer during the fall of Earth. He listened carefully as Lisa explained what her technology could do, and when she finished, he asked her one simple question. He asked if it meant they could strike the Council without being detected. Lisa told him that was exactly what it meant. The Council's sensors were designed to detect hyperspace signatures, the energy burst that preceded every ship traveling through a hyperspace corridor. Fold drives produced no such signature. A ship using fold technology would simply appear at its destination without any warning at all. The next 15 years were spent in preparation. Shipyards worked around the clock building new vessels equipped with fold drives. Training facilities produced pilots and soldiers who drilled constantly for the day they would finally fight back. Daniel Burke, now 40 years old, was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given command of the entire human military. He spent those years studying the enemy with an obsession that worried his friends. He read every intelligence report, analyzed every council battle tactic, and memorized the strengths and weaknesses of every enemy species. He wanted to know his enemy better than they knew themselves, and by the time he was done, he probably did. The council had grown complacent in the decades since the fall of Earth. They had stopped looking for humanity because they believed there was nothing left to find. Their monitoring stations were understaffed, and their patrol routes had become predictable. They celebrated their victory with feasts and ceremonies, never knowing that in the darkness beyond their borders, their victims were to return. Daniel Burke gathered his senior officers for a final meeting before the operation began. He looked at their faces and saw the same determination that had kept humanity alive for 65 years. He told them that the Council believed humanity was dead, and that their job was to prove them wrong. He told them that revenge was not enough, that they needed to show the galaxy that humanity could never be destroyed. The officers saluted and went to their ships. The fleet powered up its engines and prepared for the first strike. After 65 years of hiding, humanity was finally going home. Was bored. He had been stationed at the monitoring post above Earth for 3 years and nothing ever happened. The posting was considered a punishment, a dead-end assignment for officers who had disappointed their superiors. Earth was a trophy world, a symbol of Council victory, but there was nothing strategic about it anymore. The humans were gone, and the planet below was slowly being terraformed to suit Council tastes. He was reviewing routine sensor logs when something impossible appeared on his screen. A ship had materialized in orbit less than 1,000 from his station. There had been no hyperspace signature, no energy burst, no warning of any kind. One moment the space was empty, and the next moment a warship was simply there, as if it had always been there and he had only just noticed it. Stared at the screen for several seconds, convinced that his equipment must be malfunctioning. Then he saw the markings on the hull and his blood turned to ice. The ship was human. That was impossible because the humans were extinct, everyone knew that. But the evidence was right in front of his eyes and the ship was powering up its weapons. He managed to transmit a distress signal before the first shots hit his station. The message went out across Council space, carrying news that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. The humans were back. The dead had returned. Admiral Daniel Burke watched from the bridge of the dreadnought Perseverance as his forces tore through the Council installations above Earth. The monitoring station came apart in a flash of fire, followed by the 2 patrol ships that had been docked there. It was over in less than 3 minutes, a surgical strike that left no survivors and sent a very clear message. Across the galaxy, 46 other human strike forces were executing similar operations. They hit monitoring stations and supply depots and communication relays, appearing without warning and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The attacks were perfectly coordinated, striking at the same moment across hundreds of light years, demonstrating a level of precision that the Council had never seen before. When the Council reinforcements finally arrived at Earth, they found nothing but debris and a single message beacon floating in the wreckage. The beacon was broadcasting on all frequencies, repeating 2 words in every Council language: "We remember." Hiran received the news in his chambers on the Dominion. He was old now, his grey skin wrinkled and his movement slow, but his mind was still sharp. He had ruled the Council for over 60 years, and in all that time he had never faced a crisis like this. The humans were supposed to be dead. He had personally declared their extinction, and now they had returned, striking at the heart of Council power with technology that should not exist. He demanded answers from his military advisors, but they had none to give. The human attacks had come without warning, and the ships responsible had disappeared before they could be tracked. The Council's sensor networks, designed to detect hyperspace travel, had not registered anything unusual until the moment the human vessels opened fire. It was as if they had appeared from thin air. Ran ordered a full military mobilization. He summoned the war fleets of all 12 Council species and commanded them to assemble the largest armada in galactic history. If the humans wanted war, he would give them war. He would hunt them down just as he had done 65 years ago, and this time he would make sure none of them survived. The Council fleet grew to over 15,000 warships, crewed by soldiers from a dozen different species. They spread out across the galaxy in search of the human, determined to find and destroy the base from which these attacks had been launched. But the galaxy is vast, and the humans had learned from their previous defeat. They had hidden themselves well. Captain Maria Santos led one of the scout squadrons that watched the Council fleet's movements. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a tactical mind that had earned her a place at Admiral Burke's side. Her squadron used fold drives to jump ahead of the enemy, observe their positions, and then vanish before they could be detected. She reported back to Burke constantly, keeping him informed of every Council movement. The Council searched for months without finding anything. Every time they thought they had located a human base, they would arrive to find empty space or a cleverly constructed decoy designed to waste their time and resources. The human scouts were always watching, always one step ahead, and the frustration among Council commanders was growing with each passing day. Commander led the raider squadron known as the Grey Wolves. They were the most aggressive of all human units, striking at Council supply convoys and then disappearing into the void before retaliation could arrive. Was 35 years old, a pilot who had grown up dreaming of the day he could fight back against the species that had destroyed his ancestors' world. Now he was living that dream, and he was very good at what he did. His squadron destroyed more Council ships than any other unit in the human fleet. They would appear in the middle of a convoy, weapons already firing, and tear through the enemy before they could react. By the time Council warships arrived to protect their transports, the Grey Wolves were gone, leaving only wreckage and silence behind them. The Council began to change their tactics, traveling in larger convoys and keeping their ships close together. They were scared, and scared enemies made mistakes. Admiral Burke watched their movements and waited for the right moment to strike a decisive blow. He knew it would come eventually because the Council was too proud to accept a stalemate. They would commit their forces to a major offensive, and when they did, he would be ready. The War of Shadows continued for 2 years. Human raiders struck without warning, and Council forces blundered through the darkness in search of an enemy they could not find. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but surely, and everyone on both sides could feel it. Something big was coming, and when it arrived, it would change everything. 2 years into the renewed conflict, the Galactic Council was bleeding. It was not the dramatic of a decisive defeat, but rather the slow drain of 1,000 small wounds that refused to heal. Human raiders appeared without warning, destroyed targets of opportunity, and vanished before retaliation could arrive. Council worlds that had never known war suddenly found themselves under siege by an enemy they could not see or predict. The economy of the Council was suffering badly. Supply convoys were being destroyed than they could be replaced, and insurance rates for interstellar shipping had skyrocketed to the point where many traders refused to operate at all. Factories on a dozen worlds sat idle because raw materials could not reach them. Citizens who had grown comfortable under Council rule were now angry and afraid, demanding that their leaders do something to stop the invisible enemy. Ran felt the pressure mounting every day. His advisors brought him nothing but bad news, and the representatives of the 12 species were growing restless. Some of them were beginning to whisper that perhaps the war against humanity had been a mistake, that perhaps they should have left the young species alone. Ran silenced those whispers whenever he heard them, but he could not silence the doubt growing in his own heart. Commander and his Grey Wolves had become legends among both humans and Council species. The Council called them demons and ghosts, monsters that emerged from the void to spread death and destruction. Humans called them heroes, the sharp edge of humanity's revenge against those who had tried to wipe them out. Did not care what anyone called him. He only cared about hurting the enemy and protecting his people. He reported to Admiral Burke during a strategic briefing, noting that the Council was adapting to human tactics. Their convoys were larger now, protected by dedicated warship escorts that stayed close and watched for any sign of attack. They were also starting to travel in unpredictable patterns, making it harder for human scouts to anticipate their movements. Burke listened carefully and then smiled. He told that scared enemies were the best kind because scared enemies eventually made desperate choices. They would try something big and risky to change the momentum of the war, and when they did, humanity would be ready to take advantage of their mistake. The mistake came 6 months later. Council intelligence reported that they had finally located a major human colony, a star system in the outer rim that showed all the signs of heavy habitation. There were thermal signatures from cities, communication signals bouncing between orbital stations, and supply traffic moving in and out of the system at regular intervals. It was exactly what the Council had been searching for. Ran committed 8,000 ships to the assault, nearly half of the Council's remaining military strength. He wanted to end the war with a single decisive blow, a demonstration of overwhelming force that would break the back of human resistance. He personally oversaw the planning of the operation, determined that there would be no mistakes this time. The fleet would arrive in overwhelming numbers, crush any opposition, and destroy the colony so completely that nothing would remain. The Council Armada traveled for 3 days through hyperspace, approaching the target system from multiple directions to prevent any escape. Ran watched the final approach from his command ship, anticipating the moment when his forces would finally bring the human threat to an end. He imagined the celebrations that would follow, the restoration of his reputation, the glory that would belong to him alone. The fleet emerged from hyperspace and found nothing. There was no colony, there were no cities. The thermal signatures and communication signals had been generated by automated systems, cleverly designed decoys that had been broadcasting false data for over 2 years. The entire system was empty except for a series of platforms and a single human vessel floating at the center of it all. The human ship was broadcasting a message on all frequencies. Admiral Daniel Burke's face appeared on every screen in the Council fleet, calm and steady, looking directly at his enemies as he spoke. He told them that they had come looking for humanity, and then he told them that they had found it. The human fleet emerged from fold space in perfect formation, 3,000 ships surrounding the Council Armada on all sides. They had been waiting in the void between stars, hidden from all detection, and now they appeared like wolves closing in on trapped prey. The Council ships were caught in the center, surrounded by an enemy that had turned their greatest advantage into a deadly trap. The Battle of the Hollow Victory began with a storm of weapons fire that lit up the darkness of space. Human ships used their fold drives to dance through the Council formation, appearing and disappearing in patterns that the enemy could not predict. They would strike from one direction, vanish, and then reappear on the opposite side of the battlefield before the Council ships could turn their weapons. Council commanders tried to coordinate, but their communication systems were being by human electronic warfare units. Ships that tried to form protective formations found themselves split apart by precision strikes that targeted their weak points. The massive Council battleships, designed to dominate conventional engagements, became slow-moving targets that could not keep up with an enemy that refused to stand still. Captain Maria Santos led a squadron of destroyers through the heart of the Council fleet, her fold drive flickering as she jumped from position to position. She destroyed 3 enemy cruisers in less than 10 minutes, appearing behind each one and tearing through their unprotected engines before they could react. Her crew performed flawlessly, executing that would have been impossible without their technological advantage. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the Council had lost nearly 5,000 ships, more than half the force they had brought to the engagement. Human losses numbered fewer than 300 vessels. It was the most one-sided victory in the history of galactic warfare, and it sent a message that echoed across every inhabited world. Humanity was not hiding anymore, humanity was fighting back, and humanity was winning. Ran received the news in his chambers, surrounded by advisors who had no comfort to offer. For the first time in his long life, the High felt something he had never experienced before. He felt fear cold and deep settling into his bones as he realized that everything had changed. The humans were no longer prey to be hunted. They had become the hunters, and the Council was now fighting for its survival. The final campaign began 1 year after the Battle of the Hollow Victory. In those 12 months, humanity had gone from a hunted species hiding in the darkness to a rising power that the galaxy could no longer ignore. The remnants of the Council fleet had retreated to there, abandoning the territories they had conquered decades ago. Human forces moved in behind them, liberating colonies that had lived under alien rule for generations. Admiral Daniel Burke stood before his commanders in the Great Hall of Haven's military headquarters. The room was filled with officers who had dedicated their lives to this moment, men and women who had trained and fought and bled for the chance to strike back at those who had tried to destroy their people. They looked at Burke with eyes full of determination and hope, waiting to hear what came next. He told them that the Council had sent diplomatic envoys offering peace. They were willing to return Earth, recognize human sovereignty, and pretend that the last 67 years had never happened. Some members of the Haven Council thought they should accept this offer, that they had already achieved more than anyone had dreamed possible. Burke understood their reasoning, but he did not agree with it. He told his officers that he was not interested in what the Council was willing to give humanity. He was interested in showing the galaxy that humanity could never be conquered, could never be destroyed, and would never be forgotten. They were going to Earth, and they were going to take it back on their own terms. The human fleet had grown to over 5,000 ships, reinforced by vessels from the liberated colonies and new construction from shipyards that no longer needed to hide. It was still smaller than what the Council could theoretically assemble, but the Council's will to fight had been broken. Their species were among themselves, some wanting to continue the war and others demanding immediate surrender. The unity that had allowed them to conquer Earth 67 years ago had crumbled in the face of an enemy they could not defeat. The fleet departed Haven on a cold morning under the pale red sun that had sheltered humanity for so long. Daniel Burke stood on the bridge of the Perseverance and watched the stars stretch as his ships engaged their fold drives. In an instant, they traveled across half the galaxy, emerging in the space above the planet where human civilization had been born. Earth hung in the void before them, changed but still recognizable. The Council had terraformed parts of it to suit their preferences, coastlines and building alien structures on the continents, but the planet itself remained. The oceans were still blue, the clouds still white, and somewhere down there were the mountains and valleys where humanity had taken its first steps toward the stars. The Council forces stationed above Earth numbered only a few hundred ships, a garrison that had never expected to face a serious attack. They saw the human fleet filling the space around them and knew immediately that resistance was pointless. One by one, Council vessels powered down their weapons and transmitted their surrender. They did not want to die for a war that was already lost. Captain Maria Santos led the first shuttle down to the surface. She had requested this personally, and Burke had granted it without hesitation. Her grandmother had been born in the city that humans had called Chicago, on the shores of a great lake that Maria had only seen in old photographs. Now she was going to set foot on the ground where her ancestors had walked, and she was going to reclaim it for her people. The shuttle descended through clouds that had not felt human presence in nearly 7 decades. Maria watched through the viewport as the land came into view, strange and familiar at the same time. Council structures dotted the landscape, but between them she could see the ruins of human buildings, weathered by time but still standing. Her people had been gone for a long time, but they had left their mark on this world. She landed in what had once been the heart of Chicago, in an open space that had been a park before the invasion. The shuttle's doors opened, and Maria stepped out onto soil that no human had touched in 67 years. The air tasted different than the recycled atmosphere of Haven, cleaner and richer, and full of scents that triggered memories she did not know she had. Tears streamed down her face as she activated her communicator and spoke to the fleet above. She told Admiral Burke that they were home. The formal surrender of the Galactic Council took place 3 months later. Human engineers had worked around the clock to rebuild the chambers of the old United Nations building in New York, it as closely as possible to its original condition. It was a symbol, a message to the galaxy that humanity had not only survived, but had reclaimed everything that had been taken from them. Hyran was brought before the assembly in chains. He had been stripped of his title and his power, and the species that had once followed him now blamed him for the disaster he had brought upon them. He was forced to sign the treaty that recognized human independence, returned all occupied territories, and established humanity as a sovereign power with full rights under galactic law. His 4 eyes burned with hatred as he wrote his name, but there was nothing he could do. The war was over, and he had lost. Daniel Burke watched the ceremony from a balcony overlooking the assembly hall. Beside him stood Dr. Lisa Grant, now an elderly woman with white hair and wrinkled hands, the scientist whose genius had made their victory possible. Below them, representatives of a dozen species were acknowledging that humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through diplomacy or patience, but through determination and sacrifice. Lisa asked what would happen now, and Burke considered the question for a long moment before. He told her that they would rebuild and remember those they had lost. They would make sure this never happened again. They would show the galaxy what humanity could become when given the chance to grow and thrive. Lisa looked down at the assembly below. The council had thought they had destroyed humanity, she said. They had believed that victory was theirs forever. Burke smiled slightly as he watched the human flag being raised above the assembly hall, the first to fly on Earth since the day of the invasion. Across the planet, in cities that were slowly coming back to life, humans looked up at that flag and understood what it meant. Their long exile was over. They had survived the darkness, and now they had returned to claim their birthright. They forgot something important about humanity, Burke said quietly. We do not stay down when we are knocked down. We get back up. We learn from our failures. We grow stronger, and we always come back. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence for all those who had died during the long years of war and exile. Daniel Burke closed his eyes and thought of Admiral Grace Holland, who had given her life to buy humanity time to escape. He thought of his mother, who had kept the memory of Earth alive in her son's heart. He thought of the billions who had perished in council attacks over the decades, whose sacrifice had not been forgotten. Then he opened his eyes and looked out at the world that was now human once again. The work of rebuilding would take generations, but humanity had time now. They had survived the worst that the galaxy could throw at them, and they had emerged stronger than ever before. The future belonged to them. The stars had always called to humanity. Now humanity had answered that call with a voice that would echo across the galaxy forever. They were home, and they would never leave again.